Hello, people. I am still in Columbia, South Carolina. Just had a weekend full of events where all the presidential candidates virtually were in attendance. And just wanted to give you the list of the candidates who I had the distinct pleasure of interacting with: Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Beto O'Rourke, Cory Booker, Kirsten Gillibrand, Bill de Blasio, Andrew Yang, Tulsi Gabbard, John Hickenlooper, Jay Inslee, Julianne Castro, Eric Swalwell, Seth Moulton, Tim Ryan, Wayne Messam. Wow. It's kind of amazing that you can go to a single locality and talk to that many candidates who are all running for president. I didn't get to talk to all of them who were there. I attempted to pose a question to Kamala Harris, but she snuck out. Amy Klobuchar also kind of snuck out. And Marianne Williamson, I just couldn't bring myself to even know what to ask her, given that she's running as sort of like the candidate who will bring spiritual revival to America. But other than that, basically everybody else I spoke. And for those of you who have never done any campaign trail journalism, quote unquote, you might not really understand the logistics of it. Some candidates seek out media attention, so they'll have these things called gaggles, where they make themselves available to journalists who congregate and ask them questions. Those tend to be the lower tier candidates. Others, you kind of just have to catch at certain moments because they have a whole team of staff that are trying to direct journalists in certain ways and usually insulate their candidate from being asked questions that they don't want to take. So for Biden, for example, I had to talk to him while he was doing what's called basically a rope line, where he goes around and shakes hands with people and answers questions. He obviously was not going to do any kind of elaborate media availability. And I'm actually going to post a video later today with the clip from our interaction. So I don't want to fully spoil it. It's not like it's a bombshell necessarily, but he said something to the effect of all Democrats basically agree with one another. This was in response to a citizen talking to him because he was trying to play down the notion that there was going to be excess division in the party as a result of a heated primary. And Biden said something like, don't worry about it. All the candidates more or less agree with one another. So it occurred to me, Biden is one of the few candidates who has not called for initiation of impeachment proceedings. At least he's the only really top tier candidate. Tulsi has not either, but she has her own reasons for doing so that are different from the typical kind of moderate political calculation type decision where certain candidates don't want to go there because they think it would be politically disadvantageous. Tulsi opposes that on the merits, so that's different. But anyway, it's just not true that all Democrats are united on that particular issue anyway. So I asked Biden, you claim that the Democrats are united, but you haven't endorsed impeachment proceedings. Why is that? And he basically said I was misrepresenting him and he wouldn't answer questions from, quote, guys like me. So I'll post the audio of that interaction in a little bit. But on one level, being at a series of events like this gives you some semblance of confidence in American participatory democracy, because you really can just show up as an average citizen and talk to these candidates. It's not as though I had unique privileges as a journalist to do so. I mean, I have an accreditation with the outlets that I contribute to, but I went to the fish fry on Friday night just through the public entrance with the regular people who were attending, and I approached the candidates as any ordinary citizen would. And there were ordinary citizens approaching them and filming them and doing, quasi journalistic activity, and that's their right. So journalism tends to get kind of almost mysticized in the sense that people make it out to be this kind of almost priesthood that you can only engage with if you have certain levels of, official approval. And that sometimes is the case in terms of where you can get in. But for public events like this, it really isn't. So average citizens can go and do their own journalism if they want. Now, you do have to work with the communications people at the running the convention, for example, that was held yesterday in Columbia in order to actually gain entry. So that is somewhat of a impediment if you're totally independent. But once you're actually in there isn't a whole lot of distinction between the journalists and the delegates and the other people who happen to be running around. So there is an opportunity available to actually scrutinize these candidates and apply, whatever criteria you think is relevant to their records and their statements and every aspect of what they're bringing to the table. So I encourage that if you're interested in participating in some way in this process, because there are certainly plenty of candidates that you can focus on. It's not as though there's only a handful that are protected from all inquiry. I'm just some schmuck, and I even got to talk to Joe Biden. I actually also spoke briefly to Bernie, even though he wasn't formally taking questions. And most of the time, it's funny because Bernie, you can tell he just has sort of an intrinsic dislike for most journalists. And he's right to have that dislike because most journalists are very annoying, ask very trivial and frivolous questions that are usually designed just to perpetuate whatever the kind of popular narrative is on a given day. So the main question that I heard journalists posing to candidates all throughout this weekend had to do with Biden's comments where he supposedly expressed fondness for, segregation as senators. And leave aside that issue, it's a little complicated. I think it's been overwrought, and some of the attacks that have been leveled have been a little superficial. But regardless of what you think of that whole issue, are people really going to remember that in 2 weeks? Probably not. And yet, that's all journalists basically wanted to ask about because they knew that if they got like a viral moment from it or if they gave their editors a juicy quote, it would further the news cycle and get them exposure. And it's just a silly approach. I try to be a little more substantive. I'm not perfect. There are certain questions one might pose to candidates that aren't wholly substantive, but nevertheless are interesting. But it really is disconcerting to watch journalists behave in that manner. It's kind of like a pack mentality that they have where they feel totally tethered to whatever is dominating Twitter and cable news on a given day. And they can't get outside the mind frame where other questions might be relevant. Now, I'm painting with a little bit of a broad brush. I'm sure there were questions posed to the candidates that were more, substantive, but that is something that I heard a lot of them running with because they basically want to goad the candidates into attacking Biden or calling for an apology or something that's just silly and ultimately inconsequential. But anyway, the question that I asked Bernie, I'm going to write. I'm structuring my reportage, so to say, where I'm going to have at least 2 pieces in different outlets. One I'm going to hopefully get up by tonight or maybe tomorrow morning on Biden and Bernie and the extent to which they have appeal within, especially the black Democratic primary electorate in South Carolina. The Democratic primaries in the South tend to be majority black. And that is the case with South Carolina, so that's the constituency that the candidates must court if they want to win, and obviously it's not a monolith. I saw plenty of black people supporting Bernie, um, but it was the case that I spoke to a lot of, especially older black folks, who were comfortable with Biden and supporting Biden, or at least tentatively plan to support Biden. And I wanted to kind of parse that, talk to some officials about that voter sentiment and how it relates to how they perceive Bernie. I did talk to a number of people who are hostile toward Bernie, and predict that he has no chance of winning the South Carolina primary. I think it would be a struggle for Bernie to win in South Carolina. But one thing what I was able to ask about Bernie, and normally when he gets journalists shouting questions at him, he tends to ignore them, or he tends to be annoyed. But I asked him a question that he actually responded to. It had to do with him endorsing Jesse Jackson in 1988. One of the very few white politicians of any real national prominence. Not that Bernie was a huge national figure at the time, but he was the mayor of Burlington, Vermont. And he endorsed he endorsed Jesse Jackson, rather, and he got slapped in the face by a constituent in Burlington who was indignant that Bernie would have endorsed Jesse Jackson. And I got Bernie to share his recollections of that, in part because Jesse Jackson was actually there at the convention yesterday, and I spoke to Jesse Jackson about Bernie having endorsed him and what shot Bernie may have in South Carolina. So that was my interaction with Bernie. I'm going to write that up today. It's funny because when you have so much content, quote unquote, and so many interviews you've done, you have to kind of spend some time just processing it all and trying to determine how you're going to structure the ensuing reporting. But I have the basic outlines of what I want to do. I'm going to work on that today, and I'll do an additional video that kind of elaborates on it. One other little funny item is that I spoke to Andrew Yang. Didn't really do an on-record interview with him. We just sort of chatted. But it was interesting. He's as cool as a cucumber. It was so funny when I watched him at this fish fry event. The Yang people have to be the loudest people and the most boisterous who have gone to these events this past weekend anyway. I don't know how it translates elsewhere in the country, but obviously there was a coordinated effort among the Yang gang to be as loud and vocal as possible in cheering for Yang. So when Andrew Yang came out on stage, Jim Clyburn introduced him, and the crowd breaks into a chant of Andrew Yang, Andrew Yang. And Yang does this triumphant pose where he's like taking in the cheers, and people are just going wild. And it was really funny, and sort of an interesting phenomenon to just observe. Yang says that he's going to do my podcast at some point. Let's see if that happens. If you're a member of the Yang gang, please encourage the Yang people to agree to that. Yang agreed that it would be epic. So that should be happening sometime in the near future. He also gave me a fist bump, which I appreciated. Anyway, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of what my activities have been like over the course of the past 2 days. And I will talk to you very soon.